There's much charm in the turn of the 20th century postcards. Delicate colors transport us into a bucolic world of pastel pinks and baby blues, even when black smoke billows. Their romantic aura can serve as a metaphor for life in the United States between the Civil War and World War I. Brutal forces were at work. The Industrial Revolution was voraciously eating up workers and natural resources. While the Rockefellers, Carnegies, Vanderbilts, and Morgans were getting extremely wealthy, their workers were paying an enormous price.
In crowded slums, disease ran rampant. Children worked the same long hours as their desperate parents. Immigrants poured into the cities, as many as 18,000 a day coming through New York City. Jim Crow laws enshrined racial segregation in every area of life.
In spite of their efforts at reform, for multitudes of workers, conditions were hazardous and death was almost routine. By one estimate, 100 or more Americans died on the job every day. Mines collapsed on them, ships sank under them, pots of molten steel spilled over their heads, locomotives smashed into them, exposed machinery grabbed them by the arm or leg and pulled them in. Disaster followed disaster, but little changed. Valiant campaigns to form trade unions were bitterly and brutally beaten back. Meanwhile, the churches of the middle and upper classes took scant notice. Their financial interests and their theology directed their gaze elsewhere.
One workplace event came to symbolize the era. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company employed mostly young women immigrants to make blouses on the top floors of a Greenwich Village building in Manhattan.
One day, fire broke out, and the cotton scraps and paper patterns instantly caught fire. Amid screams, the workers sought to escape, but the owners had locked all the doors to keep the workers working. No help came. Some leapt 8, 9, 10 floors to their death. Most were stuck in the inferno itself. Altogether, 146 died in the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City until September 11th, 2001. Only recently were the identities of all the victims discovered.
In certain quarters, however, there had been signs of a social awakening among the churches. In 1882, the Reverend Washington Gladden had taken the pastorate of a congregational church in the tough and growing city of Columbus, Ohio. Gladden rolled up his sleeves to fight corruption, poverty, and racism, and he had a different take on what salvation meant.
Salvation? Let me tell you this. The church must work as hard for the redemption of society as for the conversion of individuals. Christian truth and love must govern all activities. Alongside personal salvation, I preach social salvation.
Gladden was celebrated as the father of the social gospel. But as the social gospel was as segregated as the society, the Black social gospel arose separately. Above all, the AME bishop, Reverend Ransom, pastoring in Cleveland and Chicago, Ransom advocated a socialist-oriented politics of racial justice, vigorously denouncing disenfranchisement, lynching, and racial segregation.
In his radical advocacy, Bishop Ransom was joined by a member of his congregation, Ida B. Wells, the nationally respected and feared head of the Anti-Lynching League.
But pioneers of the social gospel like Gladden, Ransom, Wells, and Jane Addams met fierce resistance. This came not only from traditionalist denominational leaders, but also intellectual circles.
Intellectual fervor in that day circulated around Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, that the development of species occurred through a process of natural selection, the survival of the fittest. Social Darwinists applied this to modern society. America's major exponent of social Darwinism was the eloquent Episcopal priest, William Graham Sumner.
I resent those self-appointed critics, especially those in pulpits, who tell successful men to take care of the poor. These wealthy men compete successfully precisely because they have the right stuff. They are better people than the losers. From Darwin, we know that for progress, the winners must be allowed to win, and the losers must be allowed to die off before they give birth to more flawed human beings.
Professor Sumner, do you really believe that?
Absolutely. It's the way God works in human affairs. So-called labor reforms actually deform the working of God. Helping the unfit survive is contrary to good science and God's will. Forget aid to the poor. Forget trying to educate everybody. If people are stupid enough to live in hovels and fire traps, they deserve their fate. Government's job is to allow free competition so that the best can succeed. Let the cream rise to the top.
Meanwhile, Methodism had exploded throughout the 19th century, becoming the largest religious body in the country. Building impressive new downtown churches and founding colleges, Methodists were feeling pretty proud of themselves.
The delegates gathered for the Methodist Episcopal General Conference in 1888 in New York City's spanking new Metropolitan Opera House. The bishop's Episcopal address dismissed the labor problem as not of easy solution.
One social question, however, was unavoidably dropped right in their lap. 5 forward-thinking annual conferences had elected women lay delegates, including the famous reformer Frances Willard. Here, with the eyes of the nation upon Methodism, would the women be seated?
Actually, no. The duly elected women were sent home. Tragic. But another women's initiative surfaced. This one had its roots in the vision of Lucy Ryder Meyer of Chicago. Let's ask her. Ms. Ryder Meyer, what was motivating you?
Traveling across Illinois for the Sunday School Association, I've met so many bright and eager young women who've been kept from using their God-given talents by lack of training. So I started a training school for them right in the middle of Chicago and all its problems. Last year, we got a building of our own and had our first graduating class of 15.
What are you training them to do?
With Christ as our helper, I send out these women to canvass the worst neighborhoods, visiting, we call it, to seek out the immigrant, the poor, the sick. Our training frees women to work for the kingdom of God. So we're asking the 1888 General Conference to make the Deaconess program an official ministry of the church.
Whether out of guilt for rejecting the women delegates or the belief that deaconesses would confine themselves to women's proper sphere, General Conference did institute the Order of Deaconess in Methodism. The Methodist Episcopal Church South would soon follow suit. This movement would change thousands of lives and change the church. Here are the duties officially signed to deaconesses.
To minister to the poor, visit the sick, pray with the dying, care for the orphan, seek the wandering, comfort the sorrowing, save the sinning, relinquishing wholly all other pursuits.
So William Graham Sumner and his social Darwinists notwithstanding, the Deaconess movement spread like wildfire. Within 2 years of the General Conference, there were already 13 deaconess homes between Boston and Los Angeles, and the total would eventually rise to 60. One in Cincinnati was for Black deaconesses.
Once set free, Methodist preachers and teachers raced forward to join their Congregationalist, Presbyterian, and Episcopal partners in social Christianity. The seeds planted by the Deaconess movement, now 1,000 strong, fell on fertile soil. One outstanding leader was Frank Mason North, head of Methodist Mission Outreach in New York City.
But some Methodist leaders in Ohio felt something important was missing.
I'm Worth Tippie, a native of Indiana, now a pastor in Cleveland. Some of us here in Ohio want a way for us Methodists to focus our energy on for social Christianity. I went to England to see the excellent work of the Wesleyan Methodist Union for Social Service. Then when I got back, 5 of us consulted about creating an American equivalent.
Who all were involved?
Bob Zering, who edits our Western Christian Advocate in Cincinnati, and Herbert Welch, president of Ohio Wesleyan University. We also contacted Frank Mason North and Harry Ward, a young Englishman pastoring in Chicago's Stockyards district, who's been doing settlement house work with Jane Addams and Mary McDowell. We decided to organize before the next year's general conference. With 25 initial sponsors, we called an organizing meeting in December 1907 in Washington, D.C.
How did the meeting go, Bishop Welch?
The meeting was a great success. We enthusiastically adopted as our mission to deepen within the church the sense of social obligation and to promote social service in the spirit of Jesus. We named ourselves the Methodist Federation for Social Service. They chose me as president, but more importantly, made immediate plans for general conference. After the meeting, President Theodore Roosevelt invited us for breakfast at the White House.
Wow, I wonder if that was ever to happen again. Reverend Harry Ward, as the youngest of the organizers, you were 34 at the time. You may have been the most energetic of the organizers. Tell us how things went at General Conference 1908.
Rather well, actually. We rented a theater one night for a social service rally, and 1,000 people showed up. The bishops did address the social question, but somewhat tepidly, to be honest. One moment I especially remember, a committee wanted a succinct statement on the church's position on the social question. Someone came to me and said, "Harry, draft some language for us." I grabbed anything I could find to write on, actually the back of a telegraph form, and jotted down some lines that came to have a life of their own.
Indeed, they did. These 11 affirmations became known as the original Methodist Social Creed, the foundation for later updates and expansion into the social principles. Let's highlight several of them.
The second one there, for equal rights and complete justice for all persons in all stations of life. A little further down, the protection of the worker from dangerous machinery, occupational diseases, injuries, and mortality, for the abolition of child labor. Toward the middle there, for a release from employment 1 day in 7, for a living wage in every industry. And finally, for the recognition of the golden rule and the mind of Christ as the supreme law of society and the sure remedy of all social ills.
General Conference officially asked the new Federation to make recommendations to the next General Conference in 1912. That seemed like a long time, given the urgency, so Federation leaders moved ahead, promptly to call a national conference for all Methodist social workers, that is, for all Methodists working to alleviate human suffering. In St. Louis, Federation President Herbert Welch opened the event with ringing words.
A new social conscience has been born. Christian men and women must go out from the school of Christ into the field of daily toil, prepared to apply everywhere the principles Jesus taught and died for. We must present not only a pure gospel for the spiritual person, but a whole gospel for the whole person, and a gospel which finds its way into our daily practice.
Of the 16 major addresses, 7 were given by women, 3 of them deaconesses. Deaconess Isabel Horton pointedly addressed her sister deaconesses.
I decry how Methodist deaconesses have all too often been co-opted as church visitors and Sunday school teachers. The deaconess movement must be born again and baptized anew with the spirit of social service. Let us vigorously address the social crisis, the labor and industrial issues, the industrial conditions, the racial issues, the actual life of the people.
The deaconess movement and the Methodist Federation for Social Service led a generation to rediscover the gospel Jesus proclaimed in the Nazareth synagogue.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. God has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recover of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.
Another prominent deaconess was Winifred Chappell, an Iowa native and assistant principal with Lucy Ryder Meyer at the Chicago Training School. She was a Methodist Federation for Social Service leader almost from the start. Deaconess Winifred, how did you come to be on the staff of the Methodist Federation?
Back then, my dear fellow deaconess, Grace Scribner, was the only paid Federation staff. One day, in 1922, she was killed by a car in front of Union Seminary. We were utterly shattered. They asked me to assume her position, and I tried gamely to carry on.
Looking back on those early years, Winifred, what is the legacy of the Federation and the witness of you deaconesses?
Historians make a very helpful distinction among three different expressions of the social gospel. The conservative social gospel vigorously supported charitable institutions, but stopped shy of advocating changes in legislation and public policy. The liberal social gospel did advocate change in public policy, but the radical social gospel raised fundamental questions about the morality of social systems, like the economic system, neo-imperialism, militarism, racism, and class conflict. We call it revolutionary idealism. For instance, isn't capitalism based on the cultivation of greed? What would economic democracy look like?
But overall, it's not been easy. Leaning against prevailing winds can take a toll. Living the social gospel entails a life of faith in the as yet unseen new creation God wants for us. And ultimately, it's also got to be a life of prayer. There are no better words for such prayer than those of Harry Emerson Fosdick's hymn, God of Grace and God of Glory.
Save us from weak resignation to the evils we deplore. Let the search for thy salvation be our glory evermore. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, serving thee whom we adore. So that concludes that portion of our presentation, the early days in the history of MFSA, the Deaconess Movement, the Social Gospel Movement. And George, do you have anything you would like to add, comments?
Well, you've just heard my comments.
That's true.
But I just think it's so exciting to have really discovered the extent of the intersection of the history of the Methodist Federation and the Deaconess Movement, and of the profession of social work, for instance, the emergence of the discipline of sociology in academia. All of these things that bear the terms social were emerging at the same time. And for us, it has the overarching term, the social gospel.
And so from the very beginning, you know, we know that as deaconesses and home missioners, we were social workers before the term social work even existed. And I think about, you know, through all, and if you read the book that that was referenced in the, I'll send it out in the chat in a minute, but like the deaconesses and MFSS at the time would use the power of writing to educate. They had a newsletter that that went out. Well, the Deaconess Advocate, one of the deaconesses, was the author and editor of that, and she sent out this kind of like a magazine type newsletter that went to all across the US and talked about important justice issues of the time that people didn't really talk about, like child labor laws or like sweatshop disease, prostitution, and the list goes on and on. And still even today, as deaconesses and home missioners, we're called to those places to alleviate suffering and eradicate causes of injustice. And so I think the intersection is very appropriate from then all the way to now. And that it's ironic and pretty cool, in my opinion, that George, who was the executive of MFSA for 25 years or so, is now our professor of theology of mission and teaching the deaconesses and home missioners of today. Like, what a crazy, like, you can't make it up way to, like, the connections of that, like how that even happened. But that's a pretty cool God thing. And Bridget, who's the current executive, is married to a deaconess, and so we're just so very connected. And so I will invite Bridget to share more about what we're up to today with Methodist Federation for Social Action.
Hey, everybody. Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers. I live in Chicago, Illinois, and I'm joining you from Chicago. That was a really awesome history. Half of that was even new to me, so this has been just a great experience. So thanks everybody for thanks to Megan for hosting this and for the invitation. So today we're now called Methodist Federation for Social Action, and our mission statement is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive, united Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. We have what we like to call a network that consists of multiple justice-seeking people, either individuals. We have regional communities or chapters. We have justice-seeking communities and congregations that span around 22 to 23 U.S. annual conferences, and we even have a central conference that's part of MFSA as well. There's a chapter in the Kenya conference, is a Kenyan chapter. Our chapters or regional communities, we kind of use that term interchangeably, are mainly based in annual conferences. We are a federation, so our groups are kind of semi-autonomous. They elect their own leadership, set their own priorities. And while each group is unique, depending on where they are in their particular context, what the important things that are happening in your annual conference, etc. Overall, MFSA regional communities kind of work within their annual conference to build solidarity together, particularly with marginalized communities and organizations, that we work in, coalition together, and work for justice in our annual conferences. So kind of what that looks like on the ground, a lot of that work centers around annual conference gatherings, which we're gearing up for. Yeah. And they often include things like submitting legislation, organizing for elections of delegates, or jurisdictional conferences. We did organizing around Episcopal elections, organizing to pass justice-seeking resolutions, to block resolutions that do harm to people. Groups also plan gatherings to learn together. There's often a speaker, build community, and often there's a celebration of folks who are doing justice work in their conference. Because of a lot of our work centers around like the legislative process, we have realized over the last few years that, if you're not involved in the annual conference level or the general conference or jurisdictional conference work, you might not know who we are. And I know, like, in the poll, there were some folks that are like, oh, not sure if you have a chapter or weren't quite sure, etc. And that's not uncommon. And it's something that, particularly, in the way that we have been structured, it creates an environment where MFSA tends to have been pretty clergy heavy in many areas. So one of the things that we've been working on as a new program, well, kind of new program, called the Justice Seeking Congregation or Community Program. And so it's a way for churches, Sunday school classes, seminaries, or college groups to connect in the network, to connect with each other and share resources, and to really kind of connect more with beyond, the typical clergy heavy areas to connect more with lay people, because we really do believe that change in our churches and in our conferences and in the church that we're dreaming that we want to be happens through our local church and through the laity of our churches. And so often, and also another piece about the Justice Seeking Congregation program that we've kind of found that was like not something that we intended, but that kind of in this kind of particular political climate today, that oftentimes we're seeing Christianity being used to discriminate or to do harm in different places, you know, and so this became kind of an opportunity for some churches to be able to share that they center their work in the social gospel, in rooted in social justice, rooted in care for their community, etc. And so this whole network of kind of semi-autonomous groups, as you can imagine, can be a little unwieldy, but we're continuing to work to connect with each other. And one of the major ways that we do that is through our program council. It's made up of representatives from each of these chapters, and also our board of directors. And so the program council is kind of that place where we brainstorm and share and connect and strategize across all of MFSA. And Megan is one of the co-conveners of our program council. I think maybe she shared that earlier. And then the last piece I wanted to share is that the last few years we've been really focused on conducting an internal organizational racial audit, which is helping MFSA to become a more anti-racist, anti-oppression organization. We started it kind of like at the end of 2019. We put a team together. We've been working with an organization called Crossroads Anti-Racism and Training. And we've been doing a very intensive examination of MFSA, all of our systems, our chapters, not only in the national office, but in our chapters, etc. And today we're finalizing our report. So we'll be sharing that publicly in the next month or so. And we're hosting an open webinar to share our findings and recommendations. And we just want to let you all know that everyone's invited. And I hope maybe some of y'all might tune in and join us in this very important work of interrupting white supremacy within all of our organizations, within MFSA and the church, and learning to do that better. I'm going to post a couple of things in the chat. So it's just different ways that you can connect with us. Sorry, the formatting is odd there. But the first thing is just a link to sign up to our newsletter. That's probably the best way. We send out a monthly newsletter. The most we ever send is maybe like 2 things a month. We do not want to spam people, so we try to be really particular about when we send stuff to folks. There's also a link to our chapters, so you can connect with any chapters if you're looking for a chapter in your conference. There's some info about our Justice Seeking Congregation Communities program. There's a link for that, our website, and just some other resources. We're on social media. We have a bookstore that has all sorts of justice-oriented books. If you have book recommendations, we welcome that too, to add to the list. And our YouTube channel, we've been hosting numerous movement-wide webinars and resources, and all of those are posted on our YouTube channel, so you should check them out. Our most recent one was focused on the doctrine of discovery, which we did in coalition with the Native American International Caucus and United Methodist for Kairos Response, which was a really, really fascinating conversation. So I'll stop there. And if there are any questions, and also the email there goes directly to me. So if you have any emails or questions, you can always follow up. Thanks, everybody.
I'd like to add a bit of history there with the relationship to Board of Church and Society. In 1952, MFSA was the victim of a McCarthyite anti-communist campaign, and we were declared sort of anathema. And so since we had been, at least informally, the only Methodist agency that addressed church and society issues, they created the Board of Christian Social Relations, sort of in a way to replace us. So as time went on, I found it very interesting that one of our former presidents, national presidents, became their treasurer, and the most recent, one of the recent staff person, the general secretaries, Jim Winkler, was at one point an intern with MFSA. He's now just the immediate past head of the National Council of Churches. So anyway, I just found that interesting that there was this rapprochement finally, and we infiltrated them.
George, can you share maybe some of the greatest accomplishments of MFSA, or the things that you were involved in that you feel like were the most impactful during your time as a director?
Well, one was that when I started as executive, there were only 2 chapters. And one of the things that we were able to do over time was help plant more than a couple dozen chapters in annual conferences. That's one thing. Another was we were the part of the denomination that was pushing the general agencies to dissociate from apartheid in South Africa financially, particularly the General Board of, then called the General Board of Pensions, which had quite a bit of investments in companies that were deeply involved in South Africa. And we eventually got them to more or less dissociate from those companies. And when I read their annual reports now, they boast about their social involvement. When we first started working to try to change their direction, they would have nothing to do with that, but they eventually have come along. So that kind of, I think, points to a role for MFSA, is to work with like church agencies to get them to put their actions where the denomination's positions are.